They mocked me at my brother's engagement, and at first I pretended not to notice because sometimes silence feels easier than explaining yourself to people who have already decided who you are. And that night, I walked into the engagement hall wearing a simple outfit, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed success or power, just something comfortable, because I was there as a sister, not as anything else. And yet the moment I stepped inside, I felt the shift. The looks that traveled from my shoes to my face and back again. The half-smiles that weren't kind. The whispers that weren't quiet enough. And I knew instantly that I was being measured, judged, placed into a box that didn't belong to me. But I stayed calm because I had learned long ago that dignity doesn't need defense, especially not in a room full of people who mistake appearance for worth. And as I approached my brother, his face lit up, genuine happiness spilling from his smile. And that alone reminded me why I came, why I ignored the discomfort tightening in my chest, because this was his moment, not mine, and I refused to let their opinions steal even a second of joy from him. But his fiancé's family didn't share that restraint, not even for appearances, because as soon as introductions began, the comments followed, wrapped in polite words but sharp with intention. Questions about where I worked, what I did, whether I was settled, whether I lived alone, whether I had plans, and each question carried an unspoken conclusion that I was less, that I hadn't achieved enough, that I was the unimpressive sibling, the one who didn't quite make it. And I answered simply, vaguely, not out of shame, but out of choice, because my life was not a performance for strangers. And still they smiled in that way people do when they think they've confirmed their assumptions, when they believe they've found the quiet one, the insignificant one, the easy target. And I noticed how some of them exchanged looks after my answers, nodding subtly as if to say, yes, we expected that. And that was when the mocking truly began. Subtle jokes disguised as concern, comments about ambition, about how not everyone is meant to be successful, laughter that lingered just a second too long, and I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, not hurt, but certainty, because I had been underestimated my entire life, and I knew exactly where that road led. And as the evening went on, their confidence grew, emboldened by what they believed was truth. And one of them, a man who would later learn the weight of his own arrogance, casually mentioned his job, the company he worked for, boasting about its prestige, its growth, its leadership. And I listened quietly, recognizing every detail he praised, every department he described, every insider comment he made, because I knew that company intimately, not from orientation meetings or employee handbooks, but from boardrooms, late nights, strategic decisions, risks taken when no one else believed. And yet I said nothing, because timing matters, and revelations lose their power when rushed. And when he asked me where I worked again, his tone dripping with barely concealed superiority, I smiled and said softly that I ran a business, nothing more, nothing less. And the laughter that followed was immediate, effortless, careless, the kind that comes when people think they're safely above you. And my brother noticed then, I could see it in his eyes, the discomfort, the confusion, the silent question of whether he should intervene. But I gave him a small, reassuring nod, because I didn't want to cause a scene at his engagement, not yet. And the rest of the night unfolded like a slow burn, comment after comment, each one meant to diminish, to remind me of my place. And with each one I felt more grounded, more aware, more prepared, because confidence isn't loud, it doesn't interrupt, it waits. And by the time the engagement speeches began, the room was buzzing with pride and celebration. And when my brother stood to thank everyone, he mentioned family, support, gratitude, and then, unexpectedly, he mentioned me, thanking me for always standing by him, for believing in him when things were uncertain, and for teaching him resilience by example. And the room quieted, attention shifting toward me, and I felt dozens of eyes settle on my face, some curious, some surprised, some skeptical. And that was when the man from earlier leaned over and whispered, not quietly enough, "Resilience is nice, but success is better." And something inside me clicked into place, not rage, not hurt, but resolve, because I knew that before this night ended, the truth would surface, not as revenge, not as humiliation, but as balance, because people should know that worth doesn't always announce itself, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the most power. And as I stood later when asked to say a few words, the room still warm with celebration, I kept my voice steady, my expression calm, and I spoke about family, about belief, about how success isn't always visible at first glance, how it often grows quietly behind the scenes. And I watched faces change as my words landed, confusion replacing certainty, curiosity replacing mockery. And then, without raising my voice, without drama, without spite, I mentioned the company, the one they had praised earlier, and I said its name clearly, confidently. And I felt the shift immediately, because I didn't say I worked there, I didn't say I was consulting for them, I didn't say I was associated, I said I owned it. And the silence that followed was heavy, complete, undeniable, because truth has weight, and when it drops, it doesn't need embellishment. And I looked around the room at the people who had laughed, who had judged, who had decided who I was based on how I looked and what I chose not to say. And I didn't smile then, not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to, because in that moment the balance had been restored, and the engagement that began with mockery had become the night they learned a lesson they would never forget. The silence that followed my words did not feel awkward to me. It felt deserved, because for the first time that evening, the room was no longer filled with careless laughter or shallow assumptions, but with realization, the kind that creeps slowly across faces when people understand they have misjudged someone entirely. And I stood there calmly, not enjoying their discomfort, but not rescuing them from it either, because lessons only stay when they are allowed to settle. And I could see it clearly now, the way the man who had been boasting earlier stiffened in his chair, his confidence draining from his posture as he replayed every word he had said about the company, about leadership, about authority, about success, and now realized he had been speaking about my life's work as if it were a trophy he owned, while others around him began whispering again. But this time the whispers were different, no longer mocking, but stunned, curious, embarrassed. And my brother's fiance looked at me with widened eyes, not hostility, but something closer to shock mixed with admiration. And I could tell she was trying to reconcile the image she had formed of me earlier with the truth standing quietly in front of her. And that is always the hardest part for people, accepting that their first judgment was wrong, because it forces them to question how often they might be wrong about others too. And I felt my brother's gaze on me, filled with pride and relief, because he knew now that I had never been weak, never insignificant, never the shadow people assumed. I had simply chosen a different kind of presence, one that didn't announce itself. And as I finished my short speech, I didn't add explanations or clarifications, I didn't describe my journey or my struggles, I didn't list achievements or prove anything further, because I didn't need to. The truth had already done its work, and when I sat back down, the man from earlier avoided my eyes completely, his earlier bravado replaced with an awkward stiffness, and others began approaching me slowly, cautiously, with forced smiles and sudden respect, asking questions they should have asked before, asking about business, about leadership, about growth, and I answered them politely but briefly, because my goal was never to impress them, only to correct the imbalance they had created. And as the night went on, the atmosphere shifted entirely, conversations softened, jokes disappeared, and people became more careful with their words, because nothing humbles arrogance faster than quiet authority. And I thought back to the years it took me to build that company, the nights I stayed awake reviewing numbers, the risks I took when failure would have meant losing everything,
the moments I doubted myself but continued anyway, and how none of those sacrifices were visible in the simple outfit I wore or the calm way I carried myself. And yet those sacrifices were the very foundation of the power I held now. And that realization filled me with something warmer than satisfaction. It filled me with peace, because I had nothing left to prove. And as the engagement continued, I noticed how differently I was treated. Seats offered, drinks refilled, opinions suddenly valued, and I felt a quiet sadness beneath it all, because respect that arrives only after revelation is fragile, conditional, and often too late. And I wondered how many people in that room walked through life unseen, unheard, underestimated simply because they didn't fit someone else's idea of success. And later, when my brother pulled me aside, his voice low and emotional, he thanked me, not for revealing the truth, but for never using it against him, for never overshadowing him, for letting him shine on his own terms. And I hugged him tightly, because family, real family, understands that power doesn't need to compete, it supports. And across the room, I saw his fiancée watching us, her expression thoughtful, softened, and later she approached me alone, without her family, without an audience, and she apologized, not directly but sincerely, admitting she had assumed things, admitting she had been wrong. And I accepted it quietly, because forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it allows the future to move forward without bitterness. And as the evening came to an end and people began leaving, thanking me, congratulating me, looking at me with new eyes, I walked out into the night air feeling lighter than I had when I arrived, not because I had revealed my success, but because I had reclaimed my space, my dignity, and my voice in a room that had tried to take them from me. And I knew that this engagement would be remembered not only as a celebration of love, but as a reminder that humility should come before judgment, and that sometimes the most powerful reveal is not made with anger or pride, but with calm truth delivered at exactly the right moment.
The days that followed the engagement were quieter on the surface, but far louder beneath, because once a truth is revealed, it does not return to sleep. It moves through conversations, through thoughts, through changed behaviors, and I could feel it everywhere, in the sudden messages I received on my phone from people who had barely acknowledged me before, in the emails that began with excessive politeness, in the invitations that appeared out of nowhere. And while part of me understood this was human nature, another part of me remained distant, observant, because respect born from revelation is very different from respect born from character, and I had learned long ago not to confuse the two. And yet, what surprised me most was not how others treated me, but how I felt inside myself, because standing up for my truth that night had shifted something deep within me, something I hadn't realized I had been carrying for years, a quiet habit of shrinking, of making myself smaller to keep others comfortable, especially within family spaces where expectations are rigid and roles are assigned early. And once those roles settle, people rarely imagine you could outgrow them. And I had been the quiet sibling, the one who kept to herself, the one who didn't boast or argue or demand attention. And over time, that quietness had been mistaken for insignificance, and I had allowed that misunderstanding to exist because it felt easier than correcting it. But now that the correction had happened, I realized how much energy it had taken to stay silent all those years, and how freeing it felt to finally breathe without restraint. And my brother noticed it too, the way I spoke with more ease, the way I laughed more openly, the way I no longer hesitated before sharing my thoughts. And one evening, as we sat together, he admitted something that stayed with me. He said that growing up, he had always felt pressured to succeed because everyone expected him to be the capable one, the achiever, while I had been allowed to drift unnoticed. And hearing that made me understand that underestimation does not only wound the one underestimated, it burdens those placed on pedestals too, because expectations are another form of confinement. And that conversation deepened our bond in a way that years of shared history never had, because we were finally seeing each other clearly, without roles, without assumptions, just as two people who had grown differently but with equal strength. And as the weeks passed, the company itself demanded my attention more than ever, not because of the engagement incident, but because growth does not pause for personal milestones, and leadership is a constant responsibility. And yet, even within my professional world, I noticed subtle shifts. Partners who once spoke over me now listened more carefully. Executives who once questioned my authority now deferred to it without resistance. And while part of that came from success metrics and results, I knew another part came from visibility, from being known rather than guessed at. And it made me reflect on how often capable people remain unseen, simply because they do not match the loudest voice in the room, and how many opportunities are missed because humility is mistaken for lack of ambition. And one afternoon, as I reviewed contracts in my office, I received a message from my brother's fiancé asking if we could meet alone, not for business, not for family obligation, but simply to talk. And I agreed, because growth often begins in uncomfortable conversations. And when we met, she spoke honestly, admitting how her family had built narratives about people based on surface impressions, how they measured worth through visible symbols, titles, possessions, influence, and how my presence had challenged that worldview in a way she couldn't ignore. And she told me she admired the restraint I had shown, not humiliating anyone, not weaponizing my success. And hearing that mattered more to me than her apology, because it showed understanding, and understanding is rarer than regret. And as we parted, I realized that change rarely comes from confrontation alone. It comes from consistency, from living your truth so steadily that others are forced to adjust their perceptions around it. And that night, as I sat alone, reflecting on everything that had unfolded, I felt a sense of alignment I had not felt before, a harmony between who I was privately and who I allowed myself to be publicly. And I understood that the real victory was not revealing ownership of a company, but reclaiming ownership of my own narrative. And that realization settled into me quietly, firmly, like a foundation strengthened beneath the surface. And I knew then that whatever came next, whatever rooms I entered, whatever assumptions followed me, I would no longer feel obligated to fit into someone else's expectations, because I had already proven, to myself most of all, that my worth did not need permission to exist.
Life did not suddenly become effortless after that realization, because clarity does not erase complexity, it simply equips you to face it without illusion. And as the weeks turned into months, I found myself navigating a new landscape where my identity within the family, the company, and even within myself was being renegotiated in quiet but persistent ways. And the most challenging part was learning how to respond to people who now treated me differently, not because I had changed, but because they had finally seen what was always there. And this required a kind of emotional discipline I had not anticipated, because it is easy to feel vindicated, to let pride swell where humility once lived. But I reminded myself daily that dignity is not proven through dominance, it is preserved through restraint. And there were moments when relatives would bring up the engagement incident with laughter, retelling it as a dramatic family story. And each time I listened calmly, choosing not to embellish or correct their versions, because I had learned that some people need stories to soften their discomfort with growth, and correcting them was unnecessary. What mattered was that I no longer internalized their judgments. And my brother's marriage brought new dynamics too, because now holidays were shared, decisions were negotiated, and subtle power shifts played out at dinner tables and family gatherings. And I observed how respect, once established, reshapes conversations, how my opinions were now asked for rather than tolerated, and how silence, when chosen rather than imposed, carries a different weight. And professionally, the company entered a critical phase, expanding into new markets, taking calculated risks that demanded absolute focus. And I often worked late into the night, reviewing projections, mentoring young leaders, ensuring that growth did not compromise integrity. And in those quiet hours, I reflected on how far I had come, not from poverty to wealth, but from invisibility to self-recognition. And there were nights when exhaustion crept in, when I wondered if carrying both personal evolution and professional responsibility was sustainable.
But each time doubt surfaced, I remembered the woman who had sat quietly at that engagement table, absorbing mockery without protest, and I felt compassion for her rather than anger, because she had done what she needed to survive then, just as I was doing what I needed to thrive now. And one unexpected moment solidified everything for me, when a young employee requested a private meeting, nervously admitting that they often felt overlooked because they were quiet, because they did their work without seeking attention. And as they spoke, I saw myself reflected in their words, and I realized that leadership is not just about guiding outcomes, it is about recognizing potential that mirrors your own journey. And I encouraged them not to change who they were, but to trust that consistency builds its own voice over time. And after they left, I sat alone in my office, understanding that the true measure of success is not how high you rise, but how clearly you remember the path you walked to get there. And family, too, continued to evolve, because healing does not follow a straight line. There were moments of closeness, moments of tension, moments of unspoken understanding, and I learned to accept them all without forcing resolution, because relationships are living things. They breathe, they shift, they require patience more than control. And one evening, as my brother and I shared tea in silence, he thanked me again, not for the revelation, but for never making him feel smaller afterward. And that mattered deeply, because it affirmed the choice I had made to let truth speak without cruelty. And as I looked ahead, toward projects unfinished and chapters unwritten, I knew that whatever challenges awaited, I would meet them grounded, not in titles or ownership, but in the quiet certainty of who I am, a certainty that no room, no judgment, no misunderstanding could ever take from me again.
Time continued its steady movement forward, and with it came a quieter kind of understanding that settled into my days, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but becomes evident in how you breathe, how you listen, and how you respond when life tests you again. And I noticed that my reactions had changed, because situations that once would have stirred anxiety or defensiveness now passed through me with calm consideration. And this was not because I had become detached, but because I had finally rooted my sense of worth in something unshakable, and family gatherings became less about proving anything and more about observing, about noticing how people reveal themselves when they believe the moment has passed. And I learned that respect gained suddenly often fades just as quickly if it is not reinforced by consistency. So I remained exactly as I had always been, attentive, thoughtful, reserved, because authenticity is the only position that does not require constant defense. And there was one particular evening, months after the engagement, when a distant relative pulled me aside and said they admired how I had handled everything, how I never raised my voice or sought applause. And while their words were kind, what mattered more was the realization that I no longer needed external validation to confirm my choices. And professionally, the company faced its first major setback since the expansion, a deal that fell through unexpectedly, sending ripples of uncertainty through the team. And I stood before my leadership group, not with grand speeches or reassurances, but with honesty, acknowledging the disappointment while reaffirming our direction. And it was in that moment that I saw trust reflected back at me, not fear. And I understood that leadership forged through humility endures pressure far better than authority enforced through intimidation. And at home, quieter moments became my sanctuary. Mornings with tea by the window, evenings reviewing notes in silence, weekends spent walking without destination. And these pauses allowed me to process everything that had changed without losing myself to momentum. And I reflected often on how easily life could have taken a different turn if I had reacted differently at that engagement, if I had lashed out or revealed my truth with bitterness. And I realized that restraint is not weakness, it is strategic patience guided by self-respect. And my relationship with my brother continued to strengthen, not through constant conversation, but through shared understanding, through the knowledge that we had both grown in ways that were not always comfortable. And one day he asked me how I knew when to speak and when to stay silent. and I told him that silence chosen with clarity is more powerful than words spoken in anger. And as the year drew to a close, I found myself standing in the company lobby during a quiet evening, lights dimmed, floors polished, everything calm, and I felt gratitude, not for the success itself, but for the journey that taught me to value presence over performance, substance over spectacle. And I knew then that whatever stories others told about me, whatever assumptions they made, I would continue forward grounded in truth, because the greatest reveal was never the company I owned, it was the strength I had learned to carry without needing anyone else to see it. As another season unfolded, I noticed how life has a way of quietly testing whether the lessons we learn truly stay with us or fade once the moment passes. And I was given several such tests in subtle forms, not dramatic confrontations, but small choices that revealed whether I had truly grown. And one of those moments came when an invitation arrived for a large industry event, where many of the same people who once overlooked me would be present again. And I paused before accepting, not out of fear, but out of awareness, asking myself whether attending would serve my purpose or simply feed old narratives. And in the end, I chose to go, not to be seen, but to observe, to engage thoughtfully, to listen more than I spoke. And when I entered that room, I felt the same calm I had cultivated over time, noticing familiar faces react with surprise, curiosity, even admiration. Yet none of it stirred me the way it once might have, because I understood now that recognition without understanding is shallow, and I focused instead on meaningful conversations, on learning from others, on sharing insights without boasting, and it became clear that influence does not announce itself loudly, it settles quietly and lasts longer. And back at home, family life continued its gentle rhythm, occasional disagreements surfacing, but resolved with patience rather than tension. And I found that I no longer needed to prepare myself emotionally for gatherings, because I trusted my ability to remain centered, regardless of how others behaved. And there was a night when my brother admitted that seeing how I handled everything had changed how he approached conflict in his own marriage. And hearing that reminded me that growth often ripples outward in ways we never plan. And professionally, the company reached a milestone that would have once felt like the ultimate validation. Yet instead of celebration, I felt reflection, because achievement without awareness feels empty. And I gathered my team not to congratulate ourselves endlessly, but to acknowledge the effort behind the success and the responsibility it carried. And later, alone, I reflected on how the engagement incident had become a quiet turning point, not because it elevated me above others, but because it clarified my values. And I realized that the greatest power is not revealed in moments of triumph, but sustained in moments of choice, when no one is watching and ego has no audience. And as days continued, I embraced a slower pace outside of work, choosing presence over pressure, understanding that life is not meant to be a constant performance. And I felt a deep sense of peace knowing that whatever assumptions people made about me, whatever stories they told, I no longer needed to correct them, because my life spoke clearly through consistency. And with that clarity, I moved forward grounded, not seeking approval, not avoiding conflict, simply living in alignment with who I had become, aware that true confidence does not need an audience, it only needs integrity.
The more time passed, the more I understood that life was no longer asking me to prove anything, but was quietly inviting me to protect what I had built inside myself. Because success without inner stability is fragile, and I had no intention of returning to that state of silent endurance I once mistook for strength. And there were days when old habits tried to resurface, moments when a dismissive tone or careless remark would trigger memories of being underestimated. But instead of reacting, I learned to pause, to breathe,
to remind myself that my worth no longer lived in other people's perceptions. And this shift changed everything, from how I negotiated contracts to how I sat at family dinners. And I noticed how people respond differently when you are no longer seeking anything from them, because confidence that asks for nothing unsettles those who are used to control through judgment. And family conversations slowly became more honest, not because I demanded it, but because authenticity invites authenticity. And even those who once mocked me now spoke with caution, sometimes awkwardly, unsure of where they stood. And I met that uncertainty with kindness rather than distance, understanding that people often project insecurity when faced with growth they do not understand. And professionally, I began mentoring leaders with an emphasis not on ambition alone, but on character, teaching them that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the wisest, and that patience paired with clarity creates influence that lasts. And one evening, as I reviewed old documents, I came across notes from the early days of the company, handwritten plans, modest goals, careful projections. And I smiled, realizing that the woman who wrote those notes had already known the value of restraint long before life tested her publicly. And that realization brought deep gratitude, because it reminded me that growth does not always mean becoming someone new. Sometimes it means finally trusting who you have always been. And as another family celebration approached, I felt no anticipation of judgment, only quiet readiness, because whatever unfolded, I knew I would meet it grounded and composed. And when laughter filled the room and conversations flowed, I participated without armor, without silence as a shield, simply present. And I realized then that the true victory was not the moment I revealed ownership, but the moment I no longer needed to reveal anything at all, because my peace was complete without explanation. And that peace became the foundation from which everything else continued to grow.
As time continued its steady forward motion, I found myself reflecting less on the moment of revelation and more on the quiet choices that followed it. Because life after exposure is not about applause, but about alignment. And I was determined that every decision I made would reflect the values I had once been forced to defend in silence. And this meant saying no to opportunities that looked impressive but felt hollow, choosing partnerships based on integrity rather than influence, and creating spaces within the company where people felt seen rather than measured. And it surprised many how firm yet gentle leadership could coexist. But I had learned that strength does not require hardness, it requires consistency. And gradually, the culture shifted. Employees spoke more freely, managers listened more carefully, and success stopped feeling like a race and began to feel like a shared journey. And within the family, the dynamics softened too, not instantly, not perfectly, but steadily. Because when power is no longer used to intimidate, it loses its grip. And my brother, once distant and defensive, began seeking my advice not as a favor, but as trust, and I offered it without resentment, because holding on to old wounds would only keep me tethered to a version of myself I had outgrown. And there were moments when I saw regret flicker across faces that once mocked me, but I did not dwell on it, because my goal was never to make anyone feel small, only to stand tall in my truth. And one quiet evening, I sat alone in my office, long after everyone had left, watching city lights shimmer through the glass, thinking about how easily my story could have turned bitter, how close I had come to believing the voices that said I did not belong. And I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to tell this story not as a tale of revenge, but as a reminder that dignity is built in private long before it is acknowledged in public, and that the most powerful revelations are not spoken, but lived. Because when you walk with quiet confidence, the world eventually adjusts its tone. And in that stillness, I understood that my journey was no longer about proving ownership of a company, but about owning my voice, my space, and my future without apology.
and that realization settled into me like calm certainty, unshakable and free.
With that certainty guiding me, I began to understand that real influence shows itself not in grand announcements, but in the everyday ripples created by intentional actions. And so I focused on mentoring, quietly, especially those who reminded me of my younger self, people who carried potential in their silence because the world had not yet learned how to listen to them. And I made it a point to sit in meetings where my presence was not required, simply to observe how people behaved when they believed power was absent. And those moments taught me more about character than any report ever could. And slowly, I adjusted systems. Not loudly, not with declarations, but with subtle shifts that rewarded honesty, encouraged accountability, and protected dignity. And these changes began to reflect outward. Partners noticed, clients felt the difference, and success followed in a way that felt earned rather than extracted. And within my family, the engagement celebration that once held embarrassment transformed into a memory that no longer carried pain, because time had a way of reshaping meaning when growth replaced pride. And there came a day when one of the same relatives who had laughed approached me privately and admitted that my silence that night had unsettled them more than any confrontation could have, because it forced them to face their own assumptions. And I listened without judgment, offering no lecture, only understanding, because transformation cannot be forced, it must be invited. And as months turned into a year, I noticed how little validation I needed compared to before, how peace had replaced urgency, and ambition had softened into purpose. And when people now asked about my success, I spoke less about titles and more about resilience, about staying rooted when storms try to rename you, about trusting timing even when humiliation feels final. And in quiet moments, I reminded myself that my story was never meant to humiliate others, but to liberate myself, and that the greatest power I possessed was not ownership of a company, but ownership of my reactions, my boundaries, and my self-worth. And standing in that truth felt like coming home to a version of myself that had been waiting patiently all along, unshaken, unseen, but always ready. As the years continued to unfold, I found myself reflecting often on that night at my brother's engagement, not with bitterness, but with clarity, because it had become the quiet turning point where I finally stopped shrinking to make others comfortable and started standing fully in who I was, without explanation or defense. And life after that carried a different rhythm, one where I chose my words carefully, my silences intentionally, and my presence meaningfully. And I noticed how people responded differently when I no longer sought approval, how respect has a way of arriving naturally when self-respect leads the way. And even within my company, the culture deepened into something more human, more aware, because leadership shaped by humility listens more than it commands. And occasionally, I would see a new employee sitting nervously in a corner during a company event, and I would remember myself at that engagement party, underestimated, invisible, quietly observing. And I would walk over and remind them through kindness that they belonged. Because sometimes one moment of dignity can rewrite an entire inner narrative. And my brother and I eventually spoke openly about that evening, not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge growth. And he admitted that he had been so caught up in appearances that he failed to truly see me. And that honesty healed something between us that pride never could. And as I look back now, I realize that success did not begin the moment I revealed ownership of the company, but the moment I chose not to reveal it until it truly mattered, because timing is a form of wisdom, and restraint is often louder than revelation. And if there is one lesson my journey has taught me, it is that being mocked does not define you unless you accept the role they assign you. But when you quietly build, patiently endure, and stay grounded in your values, life has a way of balancing every scale in its own time. And if you are listening to this story and you have ever been dismissed, laughed at, or made to feel small in a room where you did not fit the picture they expected, remember this: your worth does not need witnesses to be real, and your moment does not need permission to arrive. So stay steady, stay kind, and stay true to who you are.
And if this story spoke to you in any way, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need encouragement today, and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories that remind us all that quiet strength often writes the most powerful endings.